Welcome to another episode of Everytown. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you guys would like to listen to this as a podcast, remember that you can do that wherever you get your podcast from. So we're always available however you want to consume the content. Hope you enjoy this one. Rosalynn McGinnis became the object of her stepfather, Henri Piette's wrath when the girl's mother left him because of his abuse. The innocent young girl had become the collateral damage in Henri's retaliation when Rosalynn was abducted at age 12, subjected to different forms of abuse, and unbelievably forced to bear Henri's children. It truly takes one tough individual to survive such an ordeal, and you might think that Miss McGinnis would be eternally trapped in this sinkhole, but she persevered for 19 long years until the right time to regain her freedom finally came. I'm Andrew Fitzgerald, bringing you another insane story here on Everytown. Now, let's head on over to the town of Poteau in Oklahoma and be inspired by the story of Rosalynn McGinnis's courage and resilience. Growing up in Springfield, Missouri, Rosalynn McGinnis initially had a childhood that offered a glimpse of hope for a good future. The Irish-American girl was included in a list of honor students at her school. She played the violin and dreamt of becoming a veterinarian someday. Her mother, who was separated from her biological dad, met Henri Piette while she was handing out flyers for her neighborhood watch. They quickly became friends, which led to a deeper relationship. And when Rosalynn was only 10 years old in 1995, Mr. Piety moved the whole family to Oklahoma, perhaps to isolate them from Mrs. McGinnis's relatives. It was the start of the young girl's nightmare that was caused by her stepfather. Henri started molesting the juvenile Rosalynn, and by the time she was 11 years old, both she and her mother suffered her stepfather's abuses. Mr. Piette started raping Rosalynn while living with the McGinnis family at their home in Wagoner, Oklahoma. So, the mother and daughter duo traveled to a woman's shelter in Oklahoma, hoping to escape from the monster who was physically and sexually abusing both of them. Then in January of 1997, Rosalynn's mother decided to separate from Henri altogether after less than a year of marriage. This infuriated the abusive stepfather, so much so that he calculated an evil plan to get back at Rosalynn's mother. Unfortunately, it was the 11-year-old girl who had to pay the price of her mother's bold decision and suffered for it for 19 agonizing years. Henri manipulated his pubescent stepdaughter to marry him in a fake ceremony that he and his 15-year-old son from a previous relationship, Toby, orchestrated in the back of his van. Toby was forced by his father to officiate the bogus wedding ceremony. Mr. Piette, who was 42 years old at the time, was 30 years older than his stepdaughter. He even gave the 12-year-old Rosalynn a ring to make the fake marriage look official. Rosalynn and her mother then moved to Poteau, Oklahoma, hoping they could get away from Henri for good. But Henri had hatched a more sinister plan, which was to abduct his underage wife 1 year later. The abduction was finally executed on January 31st, 1997 with the help of Henri's son. And while leaving middle school that day, Rosalynn was lured into the van by Toby, whom Mr. Piette coerced to kidnap the girl. That ill-fated day began the sufferings of Rosalynn McGinnis, and they lasted for almost 7,000 days. The revenge, if it can be rightfully considered as such, of Henri Piette didn't end after staging a fraudulent wedding with Rosalynn and subsequently abducting her. After illegally taking her away, the wicked stepfather took Rosalynn to a Tulsa hotel room about 2 hours away and told her that her mother didn't want her anymore and that she was already considered a runaway. Miss McGinnis said much later after escaping captivity, "I didn't know what was happening. The next thing I know, my mother's not there, my brothers are not there, and none of my family are there, and I am by myself with this man." Perhaps in an effort to prevent authorities from identifying the girl he abducted, Henri then dyed her hair and forced her to wear eyeglasses and told her that she would be going by a new name. In fact, in the many years that followed, both Henri and his captive assumed different names with corresponding identification cards. He introduced Rosalynn to his own children as their new mother and planned to have more kids with her. Back in Oklahoma, the McGinnis family launched a campaign to find the missing pre-teen and had assumed that she had been taken by Mr. Piety. Although the search was called off about a year after it was launched, Rosalynn's name was never taken from the list of missing persons after her mother had reported her disappearance. For some time, Henri, Rosalynn, and his children lived out of his van, frequently traveling to various locations in Oklahoma and moving to new states, everything from Montana to Arizona and even California. Each time they would go back to Oklahoma, Rosalynn's stepfather turned husband forced her to mail out letters to her family so that the McGinnises would believe that their daughter was still in the state. Finally, the day came when Mr. Piety had to seriously evade the authorities, so he left the U.S. for good and crossed into Mexico in 2000. There is where Rosalynn experienced the worst physical, sexual, and emotional abuses that have conceivably scarred her for life. In Sonora, Mexico, Henri and Rosalynn lived in a small tent in a rural village and traveled to larger towns to beg for money. Rosalynn was able to support herself and Henri's children with the money she earned as a street beggar. Then, she eventually learned to make homemade items such as honey and ice cream, which she sold to help their finances. But the incessant abuses of Henri continued on, and Rosalynn had to endure being sexually assaulted by her evil stepfather again and again. Living in poverty and evading U.S. authorities didn't prevent Henri from having more kids with Rosalynn. The almost daily forced sexual encounters impregnated the 12-year-old girl, but she suffered a miscarriage. Not knowing what to do, Rosalynn followed Henri's instructions to flush the fetus down the toilet. At 15 years old in 2000, Rosalynn became a mother for the first time and was followed by 8 more children, all fathered by Henri and brought to life without any medical assistance. But in public, Mr. Piety would introduce Rosalynn as his daughter, who got impregnated by her Mexican boyfriend and left her. When Miss McGinnis turned 18, she was then compelled by Henri to go to a police station in Arizona, where they were living at the time, to tell the officers that she ran away from her Oklahoma home so that her name would be removed from the National Missing Persons Registry. When she was finally free much later on, Rosalynn recalled that nerve-wracking moment. He parked 3 blocks down the road from the Phoenix Police Department, and he had 3 of my children. He told me what to tell them, He said that if I didn't come back within 2 hours, I would never see my children again. She wanted to escape, but she always got caught by Mr. Piety and suffered the dreadful consequences, which Rosalynn had been used to by that time. Life in Mexico was closest to living in hell, not only for Rosalynn, but for her children as well. She continued to helplessly endure the horrific abuses her fake husband unleashed on her. Rosalynn said, "Any kind of abuse that you can think of, he did it to me." She experienced being beaten by Henri with a baseball bat, beer bottles, an assault rifle, and a stainless steel frying pan. And the children weren't spared from the cruelty of their father either. He hit them with boards and rocks, pulled their hair, and threatened to kill them with a machete. Henri likewise molested his daughters and gave them a stern warning that if they attempted to escape, he would find out and then beat them. But his oldest son with Rosalynn eventually managed to escape as a teenager. The money the kids earned from begging on the streets in order to fund their life on the run was spent by Henri on alcohol and drugs. But the most heartbreaking for Rosalynn as a mother was witnessing how her children were verbally abused by their own dad. He would tell them they were animals. He would treat them like animals as well and say to them that the only reason that they're alive is because their mother was there. Otherwise, if she wasn't, he said that he would kill all of them. Miss McGinnis tried hard to protect her kids, but Henri would beat her up every time she did. What could be a more hellish life than this? For 19 years, the thought of making it out alive often crossed Rosalynn's mind. She said, "I figured I would escape with my life or with my death." She persevered, and fate unexpectedly paved the way for Rosalynn to meet two strangers, who then opened the gate to her and her children's freedom in 2016. Early on in that year, Rosalynn and her children, with Henri in tow of course, bought grocery items from a supermarket in Oaxaca, Mexico. Lining up at the checkout counter, an English-speaking couple who only wanted to be identified as Lisa, an American woman, and Ian, an Englishman, for safety reasons, came to the rescue when Rosalynn was short on cash for her bill. The couple helped her. They initiated a conversation, and a friendship was formed among them. But Rosalynn introduced herself as Stephanie, while Henri used the alias Bill. Lisa and Ian noticed the age difference between Henri and Rosalynn and the many children that they had. And they knew something wasn't right, and so they wanted to know more about the family. Just as their friendship was starting, Mr. Piety relocated his big family to a ramshackle house in a remote, mountainous area. Despite this, though, Lisa and her husband kept in touch with Rosalynn and decided to see her and her family. On that visit, Mr. Piety accidentally mentioned that he was 62 years old, and Lisa had been told by Rosalynn that she was 32. The eldest child in the family was 17 years old. When Lisa did the math, she easily figured Rosalynn gave birth at 15, while Henri was already 45 at that time. For the curious visitors, this was a red flag, and she thought, there's something seriously wrong. Lisa's suspicions grew even stronger upon witnessing that Rosalynn's 8 children were living in 3 cubicles that were little more than the size of a walk-in closet. Lisa stated they were all skinny as rakes, and the children said that Piety told them he didn't love any of them. She wanted to support Miss McGinnis and her children, so Lisa and Ian offered to help Rosalynn get Henri jailed or locked in a rehab center for drug addicts and alcoholics. As it turned out, the couple also became instrumental in the great escape of Rosalynn. Weeks after Lisa and Ian paid Miss McGinnis and her family a visit, Rosalynn was then offered a chance to run away somewhere Henri couldn't reach her and their kids. The right timing came when her abusive captor passed out from excessive drinking one day, so she told her children to pack some clothes. Whatever little money she had was then spent on a taxi that brought them to the house of Lisa and Ian, who still knew her as Stephanie. But after 2 weeks of staying with the couple, Rosalynn finally told them the truth about herself, Henri, and the circumstances that led to her miserable life. Wanting to verify the story, Lisa searched the computer for Miss McGinnis and Mr. Piety. The missing persons flyer popped up. The 12-year-old Rosalynn on the flyer was almost identical to the woman Lisa was talking to up close, and Rosalynn then told her friend, "I've been waiting 20 years for somebody to do the math and figure out that a 15-year-old or 16-year-old shouldn't have babies like this." In July of 2016, Lisa and Ian directed Rosalynn to the American consulate in Mexico, which, in conjunction with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, assisted in bringing Miss McGinnis and her children back home to the U.S. The case was referred to the FBI, and so the authorities continued to work with Rosalynn. Her statements, dozens of copies of IDs, birth certificates, and Mexican documents presented were the basis for the Mexican prosecutor's office to initiate federal charges against Mr. Piety, who, at the time, was still at large in Mexico. While Rosalynn was now starting her new life, Henri was inching closer to his end. Since Henri had left Oklahoma with Rosalynn and his kids in 1997, he had been an elusive catch for the U.S. authorities. Finally, though, in September of 2017, he showed up at the American Embassy in Mexico to ask for a new passport, and that's when authorities arrested him. The FBI and Mexican authorities teamed up in processing Henri's deportation to the United States. In October of that year, the abusive man was flown back to the U.S. to face his crimes. At the Wagoner County District Attorney's Office in Oklahoma, Henri told the FBI that he thought Rosalynn was already emancipated at age 12 and willingly went with him. He admitted, though, that he had sex with the underage girl, got her pregnant 9 times, and physically hurt her. Henri, however, refused to be tagged as a monster and defiantly said that 99% of the allegations against me were lies. I'm telling the truth. He then added, "I never raped any children. I made love to my wife. We were married." But the court didn't hear any of that because in June of 2019, Mr. Piety was convicted of kidnapping his stepdaughter. So, on February 25, 2020, he was then sentenced to life in jail for kidnapping and 30 years for traveling with the intent to engage in sexual acts with a juvenile. The court also ordered Henri to pay a $50,000 fine and $50,000 in restitution to Rosalynn. The federal prosecutor had strong words to say after sentencing Mr. Piety. Life in prison is a sentence the law reserves for the most serious offenders like Henri Piette. For 20 years, he inflicted extreme physical and emotional abuse on the victim and her children. For 20 years, she feared for her and her children's lives. So, after 23 years, Henri faced Judgment Day and got what he deserved: a life in hell on his own. This development was a much-deserved triumph for Rosalynn, who felt pleased when Mr. Piety was found guilty in 2019, but felt greater joy and relief after Henri's sentencing. "I'm just so happy that he is put away where he can't hurt anyone anymore," Miss McGinnis told the media. She said, "My children and I suffered daily as a result of this predator's abuse. Now, we look forward to continuing our newfound life of freedom and moving forward, having a lifetime of happiness and success." Adding to Rosalynn's relief was finally telling her children the truth after keeping everything a secret until they had escaped from Henri Piette's claws. She explained, "The reason I didn't tell them, of course, was because what I knew inside was how much it damaged me. I didn't want them to grow up knowing that." Expectedly, her children were shocked to find this out. Rosalynn started rebuilding her life by launching a GoFundMe, in which funds raised would help sustain her family and support her dream of completing college. She wanted to finish criminal law and become a private investigator in order to help solve cases of missing children, a cause obviously close to her heart. Rosalynn has been a lost daughter, a forced juvenile wife, a teenage mother, and a victim of all kinds of abuse. But beyond all these images of a wounded person, Rosalynn McGinnis is more importantly a woman of courage and resilience, a survivor in her own league. Thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode of Everytown. For even more creepy stories you won't find anywhere else, go check us out on patreon.com/scarymysteries for weekly videos and much more. We'll see you next week for another episode of Everytown. And who knows, maybe your town will be next.